Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I wanted to make a dedicated thread on discussing various folklore from your country and interpret their meaning. What do you think they mean? You can find a lot of hidden symbolism and wisdom in folklore, especially old ones. If you have an old story you'd like to share, then dump it here and tell us your interpretation of it. I'll start with two from my country, two ghost stories. The first is the story of Þorgeirsboli. The next one is the story of Kristján Ólafson's memorial gravestone. Both of them have great symbolism that are a reference to the old ways, fornu sirnir, even though they are written in a time when people had forgotten what they meant. The first is the story of Þorgeirsboli. Þorgeirsboli was a shape-shifting undead bull chimera that was created by a sorcerer in the 1700s as revenge. He was a workman, the by then equivalent to a Scandinavian slave from previous eras, who lived on a farm in a northern fjord. I forgot its name. He was a very vindictive man, and those who crossed him always were made to pay dearly. One day he was in love with a woman in the area, but she didn't love him back. He was furious by this, and used sorcery to create this bull to kill her. In the end it did, crushing her with its weight, and then went on to follow Þorgeir for the rest of his life and his descendants. This bull demanded sacrifices to satiate its anger, and became his family's fylgja, following spirit, karma in a shape. This is of course a story of the destructive effect of anger and hatred, but through the lens of the concept of a fylgja in the old ways. A fylgja is like a totem, a following, animal, spirit based on yourself that is an aspect of yourself. It kind of works like karma. It is shaped by your actions and previous lives and determines the outcome of your actions. But it's different in the sense it takes up a form and a name. This is the trend with many concepts in the old ways. They can follow an individual and a clan, but in ancient Scandinavia the word fylgja was mostly just used for a guardian spirit or totem of an individual, and for a clan it was hamingja, the concept of the cyclical rebirth of man, the walking in shapes that you do through your descendants. By the 18th century, however, the word hamingja took a different meaning, happiness or luck, and the word fylgja was instead used for both scenarios, its true meaning hidden and lost in the process. The next one is the story of Kristján Ólafson's memorial gravestone. There was once a farmer who wanted to build a forge for his farm, but he had no stones to build it from. He ordered his workmen to go and break the memorial gravestone, and pick up the pieces to use as bricks. The workmen did so, and they could finish the forge. One night the workman dreams of a darkly clad man standing above his bed. He told him to tell his master to return the stones. The workman did not think much of this dream, but when he woke up the next morning he was surprised that his master was not up and about. He went to his master's bedroom, and his master asked him if he had seen a man that night. The darkly clad man told his master that what they did was a great misdeed, for this stone was his only memorial. How it's written in the story can also be interpreted as his only memory. The master told the workman to return the stones as they were, but his health was never good for the rest of his life. This is a story that has a hidden message that can be easily overlooked. It's the part where the ghost tells him that the stone had his only memories. This story can tell you a great deal why we have memorial stones above our graves today in Europe. In ancient Scandinavia, names were important for they were the keys to unlock the memories of your previous lives. Many burial mounds had memorial stones nearby or on top of them. The difference between the ancient stones and the ones used today was that the name of the actual dead person was often not revealed. Instead, names of his deeds, his possession, his family and friends were mentioned. This was because it was a puzzle. If you answered correctly, remembered the name. You would be granted access to it because you were that person reborn. The memorial stone in the story was a rune stone, from a time when Iceland was first Christianized, hence his name, but the same old tradition lived on. This story reflects that.
Bäckahästen. It's a horse that children find so beautiful that they want to ride it, and it drowns them instead.
Iceland is based. More, please. Have you had any encounters with elves/fairies/Vader, etc.?
I have encountered spirits and ghosts a few times in my life, including elves. My first encounter was with a shape-shifting spirit when I was 6 or 7 years old. It appeared as a bull and it was standing in a very powerful spot of our lands, a place of elves. When our animals are outside in bad weather, they always go to that spot. We don't own any cows or bulls, and the next farm with one is separated from us by a canal, and a cow or bull wouldn't be able to pass over because it would sink in its marshy environment and possibly drown. The bull then walked into the ground of the hill, and then rose up again as a man clad in robes with a wizard hat. I was afraid but curious, and ran back home to tell my grandfather. He didn't believe me, and when I showed him the place, the spirit had vanished. For most of my life I thought it was Þorgeirsboli, but due to events these past 2 years I know it was something else. I then felt and saw ghost plenty of times, most not that interesting. But, last year I had an interesting dream. It was very vivid. I was a child again, and was walking in the wild forest we planted near that spot on the hill. It was much larger than in reality. The animals were friendly and I was friendly with them. I walked further, when I saw a crescent cliff surrounding the front of me that had 10 white forest cats sitting on top of it. I knew that they were elves, and the rulers of this land AHD hills. I walked further, saw a pack of small dogs and a wolf pup. I wanted the wolf to follow me, but it didn't. Saddened by this, I walked further. All went silent and I saw a raven sitting in front of me. I knew that raven had been watching me, being a part of me always. I saw my FYLGJA, totem, and the first clue to who I was in my previous life. There is a tale of the Południca in Poland. It usually appears before a storm or on a sunny day. It has a scythe or a sickle and it lures people as it looks like a beautiful young woman in a white dress and a flower crown. It lures its victims toward herself in the middle of a field, then it kills them. It is also said to be accompanied by dogs. Either way, the victim gets lured then killed.
In Chile there is this creature called Chon-Chon, is the head of a witch, male or female, that flies only at night, bringing death and diseases. The curious thing is that more or less the same legend goes around for South America up to Mexico with not that much changes. Even though you could argue in every culture there is a flying head or severed body part causing death, this one is extremely similar, which speaks volumes of how much more connected than we expected these cultures were.
That's very interesting, but not unexpected. In Europe, all of the myths have their differences, but in the end they boil mostly down to just linguistics. Is there more you could tell about that creature?
Yes. Well, first I must clarify, it is understandable that in Europe you see this, cause relations between cultures were more common. Generally when they teach you about South America and North American tribes, it tends to be explained as if every tribe or empire live in their region without contact. That is why I clarified that aspect. In regards to the Chon-Chon, it is also called tutu, in the form of a bird, because tutu it's the sound that makes a little black bird from the south of Chile. You can imagine that those folktales scared lots of people due to the existence of a real sound. Witches in Chile were part of the Mapuche folklore, which was war-centered, so witches had lots of power that wasn't bad in the context of their culture. But with the arrival of the Spanish people, Christianity tend to look at this pagan aspect of their culture as dangerous thing, so this aspect was banned. But even today, you can still read some news in places like Chiloé, a small island in the south, where people are arrested because they try to kill its neighbor, because he had cursed them.
There's the most popular La Llorona. Seen a lot of her in the American media lately, but they don't seem to ever get her spooky qualities right. I think because she's usually pitted against an adult, and the horror of her is that she takes lonely kids. Here's how I've heard it told. A woman was once married long ago to a man she loved, and she had many children with him. But he left her for another woman. In her agony, she can't bear to raise her children alone and kills them by throwing them off a bridge into a river and then herself. Now every body of water from Monterey to El Paso is haunted by her spirit, and she hunts little children to drown in the river. I always figured as a kid it was one of those stories made up by parents long ago to keep their kids from playing too close to the rivers and risking death. If I think on the cultural meaning, it's odd that the story has to be a mother killing her kids over her man leaving her, when I know most Mexican mothers are fiercely protective of their children. I think maybe it's a cautionary tale of how you shouldn't pick your husband over your children, or that if a woman does, she'll be haunted by that regret. Excellent thread, Icelandic bro. I'll try to contribute. I'm American, but I was reading through a Mexican thread a few months back, and it seems that witches are a very real cause for concern down there. Typically, they're said to have the power to shapeshift, usually into birds, and they're frequently associated with fire. I'll share two brief stories that illustrate this. Both of them were shared by X-Files. Story 1. Out in the Mexican countryside, a young Anon heard a strange noise out behind the house. He walked outside and saw a monstrous turkey standing in a corral. It was the size of a small horse, and its eyes glowed an eerie green color. It was breathing furiously, like an agitated horse, so loudly that Anon could hear it plainly from many feet away. Story 2. Anon was getting ready for bed one night. He and his siblings were piling into their little beds when their grandmother barged into the room shouting, "Es una bruja. Es una bruja." Translation: It's a witch. It's a witch. She ran around the room, placing scissors underneath every bed, telling the children to keep away from the window. Through the window, they could see an enormous bird flying past the window several times, screeching. The grandmother, along with Anon's mother and aunt, began to pray as they lit candles. These were candles they used specifically to pray to the saints. After all the candles were lit, the women began to pray louder, but the large bird kept flying by, until finally the candles all went out. Poof! All at once, the bird immediately vanished. In both cases, the animals are considered otherworldly, and were thought to be witches. Both Anons stated that this was their belief. I've wondered for a long time why the association between birds and witches. In England, for example, it is said that witches use rabbits and cats as familiars, whereas in Germany dogs were associated with witchcraft and the devil. With dogs, the answer is a bit clearer, since dogs literally occupy a place between the wilderness and civilization. Dogs aren't wild animals, after all. They're domesticated animals, and as such, they sit on the border between two worlds. Thus, they represent liminal spaces in general, and liminal spaces are often associated with fairies and the devil, crossroads, for example. But why the connection between birds and witches? The augurs of ancient Rome foretold the future based on the movement of birds. The Navajo, Dine. People say skinwalkers assume the forms of birds. I don't know. Any ideas, friend?
As for the connection to fire, you can see it in the candles going out at the same time as the bird disappeared. But what this means is unclear. Was the bird able to cause the candles to go out, or was the fire somehow consumed in order to repel the spirit? A different X-File said this. When I was young, I lived in Laredo, Texas. One time my dad and I went fishing down at a nearby river. It was 4 a.m. and very dark, when suddenly we saw two balls of fire floating along the river, speeding towards us. As they approached, they lifted up over us and moved in synchronized patterns. When we returned at a later date, we saw some animal by the river, and it jumped across. The river was easily the width of 2 or 3rd Street blocks. To this, a different Anon responded. Those fireballs are female Nawalas, also called brujas, witches. They use that form to enter houses and to suck the blood and souls of children. If you see these balls of fire floating towards you, you must recite the Lord's Prayer. Either that, or the Magnificat. But in either case, you must recite the prayer backwards. So again there's a connection between witches and fire, and as in the previous story, it is some type of Christian, Catholic, prayer that drives the witch away. In some sense, this must reflect the decline of ancient Mexican beliefs, which were cast as being inferior to Christianity. However, if you observe healing communities, you'll notice they use prayer exclusively. Whereas witches might utilize a, sigils and words of power, or b, herbs and plants. This stands in contrast to pure and simple healers, such as the type you find in Cajun communities. The X-File in me wants to say that these stories carry the idea about the efficacy of prayer, regardless of denomination, against other types of power.
The Mexican thing with witches shape-shifting into birds, mostly barn owls, big owls, it's a deeply held belief in their culture. When my kid was a newborn, obviously asleep in bed with my wife, and me in a small mattress on the floor. Suddenly I hear like a chicken fluttering. Wife staring outside window. I saw a fucking woman sit on one of the branches of the tree next to our window. Wearing in black long sleeve dress, a cape so we can't see her face. The terrified wife starts praying while holding the baby. Me, well, I almost shit my pants when I run to the lights on. Check tree and is fucking gone. A lot of creepy things happened when our kids were newborns, really creepy shit.
So I had something similar to this happen. I grew up in a largely Hispanic area in a large Dallas suburb. My best friend at the time was born in Mexico and moved here as an infant. So one night we were hanging out and decided to go pick up another friend. While we were waiting for the friend, we decided to go take a piss next to their boat that was beside the house. Suddenly there was this extremely loud long sound coming from the tree I can't describe. I thought it was some kind of bird that I had never heard of before. So I look over to my friend to ask him WTF that is, and he had a look of sheer terror. He looked at me and quietly said, "Get the fuck in the car and whatever you do don't fucking whistle." About the time we make it to the car, another friend comes out and we tear ass out of there. My Mexican friend is freaking the fuck out with his face pressed against the back glass, babbling something about a, probably not spelling this word correctly, fucking latrusa. We drove about a mile or so to pick up another friend. While other friends go to the door, I start asking my Mexican friend WTF is going on. The whole time he's look in the sky and say, "Fuck, it followed us." "What followed us?" I asked. "The latrusa, the fucking witch," he said, pointing to the sky. I looked up and saw what I can only describe as a black trash bag fluttering through the air and landing in the tree. Then the sound started again. I have never in my life been frozen in fear until then. About that time friend 2 and 3 come out and we leave and drive across town about 8 or so miles. As we drove off, we see the black trash bag fly out of the tree and start to follow us. At this point I completely freaked the fuck out. As we're driving, I ask my Mexican friend what in the hell is happening. He tells me that it's a witch and it's following us for some reason. He tells us all whatever we do, don't whistle. He says that if you whistle they will come down and take your eyes. He tells us that when he was younger, around 6 or 7, he was in Mexico visiting family and he and his grandfather were walking home from the store and they heard the sound. He said his grandfather dropped everything, picked him up and ran home. They said that when they got to the house his grandfather put everyone in a bedroom, grabbed a shotgun and locked them in. He said that a few seconds later he heard the sound followed by a gunshot. His grandfather came back in and let them out and told them everything was okay. He said that a week later his grandfather suddenly went blind and died a couple of days later. He also said that these witches usually come around when a man is either hurting his wife or children to punish the man. Since this happened, I have only ever heard that sound 2 more times. Both times I was living in a predominantly Hispanic area. If anyone else has had a similar experience, please let me know.
I've heard of this on my dad's side. I'm Mexican American. Born here, so have my parents and grandparents, but in a city that is 90% Hispanic. My grandma and my dad's side had 9 sons and 2 girls, and their father was apparently an abusive piece of shit, but mostly to their mom. A drunken womanizer that'd cheat on her and beat her. She put up with it till her sons got older and started kicking his ass and threw him out of their home. Now that could be a fine end to it, but from what I hear told of my grandma, she was very religious. Her sons wanted her to live with them to stay safe in case their father tried coming back, but she would always tell them not to worry, that she'd be safe because of her roses and the birds. She had a ton of roses planted all around her home all the time, and with her husband gone she planted more. She also was incredibly nice to birds, having many bird houses and bird feeders, and she always told her kids it was a sin to hurt a bird, and they'll get back at you. And the husband never did try coming back. She actually had her sons pick him off the streets when she learned he was dying, blind and homeless, so she let him die in their home. The sons didn't want to, but she said he'd suffered enough. Well, the second oldest, my Tio Jr., was also a womanizing asshole that'd slap his women around and dog them and cheat. He'd also punch men behind their backs and curse anyone that tried to help him, just an overall dick. He got no karma, such as suffering in the street. Their mother left him and my father the house, with my father not needing to live there and just maintaining it. He died recently of some severe stomach cancer. But as he died, his brothers teased him with the whole, "This is your karma for being such a dick." He said there was no karma for him, since the witch that mom sent after dad would never come for her kids so long as they visited her home. Now I was there when my Tio was dying, babbling about he'll have no witch curse him, and thought, this a deluded dying man thinking his mother will save him. But my dad and uncles just treated his words like, yeah sure, of course mom has a deal with a witch to protect us, doesn't mean you're not still here dying of cancer. My dad told me that with his late wife they all jumped him when he wouldn't stop beating her, and told him they'd give him a beating if nothing else would every time, so he stopped hitting her. My grandma also told them when she was dying that they didn't have to visit her grave, but they had to visit the house every weekend. Which they always did, just to have drinks with each other and play pool and cards and talk shit they still do it. The only one she didn't want to ever live there was her oldest grandson, whom she hated for some reason. She wanted Dad and Tio Jr. to promise never to let him live in her house, but my dad built an efficiency out in the back so that grandson could live there instead. I've never seen such a bird witch in my life, but my dad says I never should. He's just told me that if I'm nice to nature, and nature will be nice to me.
Alright, here's one of the stories that was shared with me. Turns out I had a few stories about lechuces that people sent me, but this one is pretty short, so it gets the point across. For starters, I'm from Mexico, right along the border. Lots of people here are superstitious, but my dad was a huge skeptic. He studied genetics, has a PhD, and is basically a materialist scientist. He doesn't believe in spirits or God or anything. But he told me this really weird story from the time that he was forced to live in a smaller town for work. He rented a very big house during his stay. There were 8 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, just to give you an idea of its size. His neighbor was a little old lady who owned a yerberia, which is basically a little store that sells folk remedies, plants and herbs and stuff. The old lady is very well respected in town. One day, during a casual chat, one of the locals mentions to my dad that his neighbor is rumored to be a powerful witch. Dad, of course, laughs this off as a stupid rural folktale. He tells the locals that there are no such things as witches, and the two part ways. Later that week, as he's coming home, the old lady is standing at her door watching my father approach his front door. My father hollers a hello, and the old lady waves in a very slow, deliberate manner. The next day, when he's leaving for work, there she is again, but this time she calls him over.
Tonight, after work, why don't you come and visit?
My dad agrees, and the woman smiles and nods. Then she goes into her house and Dad goes to work. Later that night, he pays a visit to the old lady, and she leads him towards the back of her little shop, where Dad is surprised to see red and black candles lit everywhere. On the floor, on the table, everywhere. Although a small window is open, it's late in the evening, so the candles are the only source of light anywhere. Dad watches silently as the old woman ambles over to a table by the window and sits down. She motions for him to sit in a nearby chair, which he does. Then, she begins to speak very quietly, and my dad leans in, thinking she's speaking to him. But then he realizes that she isn't talking. She's chanting. At first softly, but then her voice gets louder. When he realizes this, Dad scoffs and covers his mouth. His instinct is to laugh, but he realizes this will seem rude. So he continues to watch the old lady, curiously. And then he saw something that he couldn't explain. He couldn't even really describe it to me. All he said was that the old woman began to change in front of his eyes. She spread her arms out to her sides and they turned into wings. Then her large nose began to shrink, smaller and smaller until it had turned into a bird's beak. Dad found himself face to face with una lechuza, an owl. Dad was too stunned to speak, and before he could gather his wits, the lechuza broke the silence.
Do you have the proof that you need now?
It asked him. The voice sounded human at first, but then it changed into a strange bird-like cackle. The lechuza turned and flew out through the small window into the darkness outside. Dad jumped out of his chair and rushed out of the yerberia and towards his rental home, and never again went out after dark during his stay in that town.
I haven't noticed anyone talking about Brazilian folklore, so I'll tell you some I have heard. Not my personal experience, though. I think one of my favorites is Curupira. He appears as a young boy with flames in his head and red eyes. He is a spirit of the woods, who protects the forest from the banderantes, and anyone who would want to hide the nature. His feet are also turned backwards, so he can lose people trying to follow his steps. I think it was sort of a mythical rebuttal of the locals to the invasion of the Portuguese. There's also others, like Boitada, Bodo Suardarosa, Ayera, Saisai. But that comes mostly from the Tupi-Guarani culture. As for other regions, we have the headless mule, Mula Semkabika, which is the ghost of a woman that was cursed after sleeping with a priest or something like that, and the Bicho Papeo, who's a monster that eats kids and was made with the sole purpose of making kids afraid to leave their homes, according to my mom.
Here in Brazil, we have the Mapinguari, also called Isnashi. He is an indigenous legend from the Amazon region, a hairy giant with an eye on his forehead and a mouth on his navel. He emits a scream similar to the cry given by the hunters, If someone answers, he soon goes to meet the unsuspecting, who ends up losing his life. The creature is wild and does not fear hunters, because it is able to expand the steel when it blows into the barrel of the shotgun. Usually those who manage to survive are crippled or have terrible marks on their bodies for the rest of their lives. Some say that Mapinguari only walks through the forests during the day, keeping the night to sleep. When he walks through the woods, he screams, breaking branches and cutting down trees, leaving a trail of destruction. Others say that it only appears on holy days or holidays. They say he only runs away when he sees a sloth.
Well, at least I could recount some I've heard and known, but since it seems that my third eye is blind, I've never actually experienced any of this. Let's start with the spiritual protectors of my city. So, Yogyakarta is located between Merapi volcano to the north and the Indian Ocean to the south, and both had their own spiritual courts, so to speak. Legend has it that the first Sultan of Yogyakarta, it was a city-state, had meditated so hard that it caused mayhem in the spiritual landscape, kinda like a spiritual earthquake of sorts. This attracted the attention of a powerful spirit, Nyai Rara Kidal, the Queen of the South Seas. She approached the Sultan and told him that she fell in love with him, and gave him an egg, to be eaten whole if he returned the feeling. Not one to trust a spirit, he then gave the egg to his gardener, which turned into a hideous spirit. Ashamed of his new form, the gardener fled to the depths of Merapi volcano, and ended up setting up his own spiritual court as Kyai Sapujagad. Thus, to this day, there are annual offering processions to the south shore and the volcano, to honor an ancient pact between the sultans of Yogyakarta and these two spiritual guardians, so that Yogyakarta is protected from harm.
I'd like to add another typical and famous ghost story from Iceland, but it's not very creepy and is more of a moral story using symbolism from the Fornu Sea, like the story of Þorgeirsboli. The name of this she-ghost follower was Móhusa Skotta. There was a man named John the Rich Ólafson, whose name spread all of the southern country. He was originally poor, but somehow got over a great deal of wealth in a short amount of time. He first lived in a farm called Refstokki, near fir dunes. There he met a teenage girl one night, who asked for shelter. He refused her, and she died that night. After that, she would haunt him for the rest of his life as a fylgja, causing much misfortune to him and those around. One day she got along with another fylgju called Selsmori, later called Kampholtsmori. I met this ghost personally when I visited his home and he followed me. Later she killed a man named Thomas, who then resurrected and joined them. They wreaked havoc on Eyrarbakki, the town in the area, and John the Rich hired Móhusa to banish her. Móhusa was a priest and it is not known how he banished them. Some say that he made them follow him to the eastern country, where he was almost killed in a fight between her. In the end, he managed to banish her and she was never seen in Eyrarbakki again. He however refused John's payment. There are many ghosts with almost identical stories. Skottas are female human ghosts, and Mora are male. The general message of them, whilst having an historical background, references one of the Icelandic values present in Havamal. When someone walks over a mountain to get shelter from you, the honorable give him shelter. Then they also do it through the symbol of fylgja from the old ways. Another interesting story is that of some sorcerers. There was a farmer who practiced the old ways. He lacked more workers, slaves, and got the brilliant idea of resurrecting a dead person and make him his slave, since they wouldn't tire. He went with a friend and started the ritual. He successfully resurrected him and started to give him orders. However, the dead man didn't understand him at all, and the sorcerer didn't understand the talking corpse. Apparently, it just so happened he resurrected the only French person in the cemetery who didn't understand a word in Icelandic. So, agitated from all this, the ghost started to wrestle the sorcerer and intended to take him with him into the grave. The friend rushed to a nearby priest. The priest kicked the undead in the head with the Bible, and put a large stone disc over the grave. Anyone who would remove it would reawaken the undead. This is a rather funny story and it describes the relation Christianity and the old ways had in Iceland. In other stories, when the priest was totally useless, a powerful sorcerer was instead summoned. Then in others, the priest themselves were the sorcerer. This cemetery is just a few hundred meters above my farmland and is now long since abandoned, and my grandmother once saw the stone.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.